Joining me now, Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn, co-authors of Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Thank you so much for taking some time and talking to us about this book. I want to know first and foremost, when you set out to write something, of course, you already have what you think you are going to find. What changed throughout the process of writing this, in your opinions, on what is happening to America?
I think one of the things that struck us was how many children are affected and vulnerable. So we knew going into it that so many of my classmates had been struggling with drugs, alcohol, suicide, that a quarter of the kids on my old school bus were gone. What we hadn't appreciated was how many of their kids and grandkids were really at the edge of an abyss and in very difficult conditions because of these sort of, some toxic home environments.
What struck me is that jobs are so central to people's existence, and that jobs are not just a stream of income. It's not just the money that you get from the job, but it's also a sense of purpose, a sense of identity and belonging. And so when jobs disappear, it not only, is bad for the individual person, but it really creates a sense of loneliness and alienation, and that's how people started sort of, falling into a downward spiral.
I mentioned to you that I grew up in a Rust Belt community in northern West Virginia, and a lot of what you wrote reminded me of some of the things I noticed in my hometown. One thing really struck me, and you talked about the social clubs that existed when you were growing up, and the little community groups that were there, and how those have all kind of deteriorated, and that sense of community left along with it. How important do you think that parallel is?
So we think that the reason that Yamhill went through these struggles was essentially that jobs left. But it was also true that during the Great Depression, jobs left, and you didn't have this kind of unraveling. And we think that the difference was that in the Great Depression, you still had all these very strong community institutions, churches, local men's organizations,
darts
bands,
clubs,
PTAs,
things like that.
Exactly.
Right, exactly.
And that those had diminished, and they were just overwhelmed by the needs in the 1990s when so many men in particular lost their jobs, and they couldn't cope.
The other difference, I think, is that back then when you had alcohol, that was a problem if people became alcoholic, but you could still function as an alcoholic, and it was also a social liquid. But here, nowadays, we've got drugs, which are much more insidious. And drugs actually destroy social capital. If you're doing drugs, people don't want to associate with you because you're just, internalizing everything. You're just sort of, moving into yourself. Mm-hmm. So I do think that the influx of drugs has made a very big difference between back then and now.
The two of you, I would assume, had different experiences covering this and writing this book because you grew up here and you're kind of reliving a lot of things that you saw as a child and now where things have gone, and you're kind of picking up at a different point in your life and getting to kind of see all of this unfold. How would you say the two of you experienced?
Sheryl is an honorary citizen of Yamhill
at this point,
though.
Right. But how do you think, how did the two perspectives help you to tell this story? And did you ever have any difficulty kind of coming to terms on certain things and how to tell it?
Look, we come at things from different perspectives. We've done 4 previous books, and there are certainly disagreements, but that's also true of raising kids. We managed to raise 3 kids and stay married. So in that sense, a book is a piece of cake. I think that to some degree we divided up by me emphasizing the reporting with people from Yamhill who I'd known all my life, and Sheryl has a background in business and finance and economics, and trying to look at the larger tapestry and the backdrop that led to these kinds of problems all over the country. You mentioned your own town in West Virginia. Yeah. Every place we go, people say, I grew up in Maine and Kentucky and Ohio, and my town is exactly like yours.
I bet.
But I think the perspectives that we bring are different, partly also because, and helpful, because I grew up in New York City, and so I have an outside perspective, and I come in just the way a lot of other people who have no idea what the Yamhill is about come looking at it. It's sort of a sense of otherness in the very beginning, and as we got to know the people more, as I got to know them better, I realized, my goodness, there's so much more beyond and behind the veneer, and that these people have talents, they're complex, they have, psychological, ruminations. They look at things in a different way than I did. And I came to really like them, enjoy their company, despite what, if you look at one of their photos next to Nick, they look very, very different. I mean, some of these people, one friend that we talk about, Clayton Green, he was 400 pounds, and he was younger than Nick. But I understood that he was a brilliant mechanic at the same time that he was struggling with his dependencies.
Now, these are people who you know from your childhood, probably even before you could form memories, really, that you still have today. How difficult was that for you to go back and tell such a personal story and to see some of the things that you're not around anymore really to help directly, aside from writing this book?
Dan, I'd spent much of my career reporting in refugee camps or conflicts abroad. And in those contexts, you may hear terrible stories, but you've got this armor, this emotional armor. As a journalist, you have a professional distance from the people you're interviewing. And when you're talking to old crushes, to people you ran on the high school track with, you have no armor whatsoever and no professional distance. And we worried a lot about what these people would think when they read what we wrote. We worried about how people would perceive Yamhill. This is a community I love. I don't want readers to think it's a place where everybody's cooking meth and falling off a cliff. And yet, the people, old friends, they really trusted us with things that were often painful to talk about, embarrassing to talk about, and we felt that responsibility very, very acutely, and I hope we discharged it.
When we talk about a fix, I think you mentioned the Great Depression before and how people lost jobs during the Great Depression and some of the acts that were taken by politicians and by our leaders at that point, and a lot of your book is pointing to the fact that you're not seeing that leadership now. Isn't that leadership kind of a representation of the people they're leading, in a way? What can people do that can make a difference to save these communities? So
I think we need a combination of private philanthropic engagement, and that we've seen that as transformative. We write about a group in McMinnville called Provoking Hope, which transformed the lives of some of our friends by weaning them from drugs. But we also need more. And at the end of the day, we wouldn't have built interstate highways with volunteers and private donors. And at the same time, when you have needs at this level, when you have a life expectancy falling in the U.S., maybe 10 million people with substance abuse issues, then we can't rely just on volunteers and donors. And so it becomes a challenge for the political process. And what is so frustrating for Sheryl and me is that we know how to address these problems. Other countries have addressed them. Parts of the U.S. have addressed them, but we need to scale them. That requires a political response, and the political system for 50 years has failed and has often magnified the problems.
Oregon has tried to be progressive in looking for ways to solve homelessness, to solve housing issues, and it seems that the issues are too difficult to tackle entirely. There are little victories here and there, but the war is being lost. What can be done? I think a lot of hope goes out the door, which you also say hope is such a big part of being able to recover. And I think hope is lost in a lot of ways. Is that something we can overcome? I
actually think that there has been a lot of progress. It just doesn't get the headlines the way the bad news does. So for instance, homelessness you mentioned. In 2010, the Obama administration launched an attack on homelessness because they were so embarrassed that there were so many veterans who were homeless. So they actually put together a collaboration between the VA, the HUD, and also the Interagency Council on Homelessness. And in 6 years, up until 2016, they had reduced veteran homelessness by nearly half. And that program actually has continued under Trump as well. And they have continued to reduce veteran homelessness. So we do have the means. It's a matter of how do we get the political will. Child homelessness, we can also address child homelessness. We have the tools, we just need the political will.
Yeah, one of the kid who was my closest neighbor growing up, Mike Stepp, is now homeless in McMinnville, Oregon, living in a county park. And at this point, there's not much we can do to help Mike. He's been wrestling with alcohol and meth for decades and decades and decades. The time to really make a difference is when people are young, and that's when we as a country need to invest in early childhood, in make sure everybody gets through high school, it gets vocational skills, and it's an awful lot easier to invest in the front end. If we don't do that, we end up paying at the back end.